Thank you, Molly. Our next speaker brings the skills of the boardroom to the fight for working families. Damon Silvers is Director of Policy and Special Counsel to Rich Trumka and the AFL-CIO. He was named by congressional Democrats to the panel that oversaw the TARP bank bailout. And from that perspective, Damon saw up close how our too-big-to-fail financial system, deregulated by the politicians who live in the pockets of the bankers, gambled with our money, brought down our economy, and then demanded that we bail them out to prevent another Great Depression. Damon has been sounding the alarm recently about the prospect of another round of austerity imposed by crazy conservatives willing and able to crash the world economy if they don't get their way. So to share those warnings with us and to tell us what we can do, please welcome the AFL-CIO's Damon Silvers.
Everybody, this is your life. You gotta get it when you can.
All right, great. Let me, since sort of, I'm the old guy on the panel, I'm going to talk about the past for a moment. Back before Time Magazine profiled Molly, Time Magazine did another issue a little while ago, 60 years ago, about the American century. And in that issue, Time Magazine proclaimed that the 20th century was going to be, or was, the American century. And now, why was that? It turned out to kind of be true. The United States kind of did prosper greatly during the 20th century. Why was that true? You could say it's true because of our vast natural resources. You could say it's true because of the genius and energy and dynamism of our population. But I want to suggest to you something that is incredibly relevant to what's about to unfold in the next 6 months. And by that I mean the election and then the clash over fiscal policy that's going to follow it. And what I'm going to suggest to you is this, that 70 years ago, when the world faced a similar prolonged economic crisis set off fundamentally by inequality and financial instability, 70 years ago, when that problem faced the entire world, the United States was the only country of any significance that addressed that crisis head-on by adopting economic policies that did the two things that had to be done. The first was to restructure the debts of our families and to say to the banks who didn't like that, tough on you. And the second thing the United States did 70 years ago was to say the most important thing that we need to do right now is to get people back to work, reinvesting in our country and modernizing our country. We did those two things, and we did them democratically. And by that, I don't mean that the Democratic Party did them, although it's true the Democratic Party did. I mean that we did them through democratic processes. Nowhere else in the world did this happen. The other sort of democratic countries of Europe pursued economic orthodoxy all the way to economic, social, and political ruin. Two other countries moved decisively to do those things, to invest, put people to work, but they did so through horrible dictatorships. We did it in a sustainable, democratic way. And now we face that same challenge again. And that is why we are here today, to try to lay out what this challenge is about. So here's where we are today. And this is critical to understanding this debate about austerity. You can call it whatever you want. Paul Krugman says we're in a depression. I'm a little nervous about that characterization, but you call it whatever you want. The global economic crisis continues. Europe has been driven into a technical recession, what economists call a recession, by austerity policies. Economic growth in this country remains weak. From month to month, it's a little unclear how weak it is, but it's weak. And we are very vulnerable to what's going to happen outside the United States. Perhaps most troubling Economic growth in Asia is slowing. Asia is supposed to be the great engine of the 21st century. If Asian growth is slowing, we ought to all be concerned. And finally, despite what many of us have been promised, the global financial system remains very fragile. This was the contribution, I think, of one of the contributions of our oversight panel over TARP. You know, just to be clear, in case any of you all are getting out your knives, you know, we didn't control TARP. Elizabeth Warren and I and my colleagues on the panel, we opined, we had the power of the pen, but we didn't actually control what happened. That was other people. But it was very clear to us that what went on with TARP did not repair the fundamental systematic problems with our financial system. And we've seen last fall the global financial system, under both pressure from Europe and from the housing markets in the United States, move towards systemic crisis again. And there is, I'm afraid, the very real possibility of systemic crisis in the second half of this year, as bad policy choices in Europe and unresolved issues in the United States, combined with slowing growth in Asia, pressure that financial system again. Now, as in the 1930s, we are living through an economic crisis created, prolonged, and intensified by bad policy choices made in the interests of the 1%, or perhaps the 1/10 of 1%, or the 1/100th of 1%. Now, you probably know all about the first generation of bad policy choices. The first generation brought us to the crisis of 2008, financial and labor market deregulation, trade policies and global financial policies that encouraged deep imbalances between different parts of the world in the way they traded with each other. Wage suppression. Wage suppression means government policies designed to keep workers' wages down. But now we are into the second generation of bad policy choices. Austerity, thinking that the way to deal with thinking that the way to deal with stagnant economies is to force them to shrink. Thinking that the way to deal with unemployment is to fire more people. Austerity. By the way, austerity is exactly what happened in Europe that discredited in the 1930s, that discredited democratic governments and brought us communism and fascism. Secondly, failure to address what has gone wrong in our banking system and the way in which it's tied to housing and to student debt. And thirdly, failing to understand, both in the United States and in Europe, that we live in government and systems of government that are bound together. Different nations in Europe, different states and cities in the United States, that we need, as Molly said to us, to look after each other. That if I'm sitting fat and happy in some place like Palo Alto, well, Palo Alto's not so fat and happy, but if I'm sitting fat and happy in Silicon Valley someplace with plenty of tax revenue, and down the street in East Palo Alto they're laying off all the teachers, I might owe some responsibility for that. My favorite quote that illustrates what has gone wrong in policymaking in this world is from a month ago at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, an organization set up of the developed countries to try to have some kind of policy. Originally it was set up to ensure that the stupidity of austerity in the Great Depression was not repeated again. But in the 1980s, this organization was captured ideologically by Reagan and Thatcher. And now it's a little unclear where it stands. But a month ago, the chief economist of the OECD made a presentation on the state of the world. And he said, countries are doing everything right. Now, understand, this guy's ideas of right are orthodox economics. Countries are doing everything right and still going off the cliff. Now, one of the reasons I like working for Rich Trumka is that he was on the panel responding to that, and Rich said back to Mr. Padawan, he said, if you think you're doing everything right and you're still going off the cliff, maybe you're not doing everything right. Bad policy choices over a generation produce this truly bizarre outcome, which is at the heart of everything that's gone wrong. The blue line on this chart is personal consumption as a percentage of our economy in the United States. And you can see that from 1990 and to 2010, it keeps going up and up and up. If you go back to 1980, it moves up a full 10% of GDP, which is a gargantuan number. Now, you would think that if personal consumption was rising as a percentage of GDP, that would mean that people were better off. But actually, it's not true. The red line, which you see going down, is the share of national income that goes to wages. We tried for 2 decades, and actually for 3 decades, going back to 1980, we tried to have a low-wage, high-consumption economy. And it simply can't be done. And the can't be done part is what we're living through now. Now, the result is this vicious cycle. The vicious cycle is what austerity policies in the face of prolonged recession produces. You start off with mass unemployment, falling real wages, and falling housing prices. That's kind of where we came in 2008 and 2009. That was the situation President Obama faced on the day he was inaugurated. That situation means that consumers, you and I, have less money to spend and to pay taxes with. It naturally produces budget deficits. Add on to that depressed housing prices that keep financial institutions weak. Right? The things that they have on their books, their loans, aren't actually worth what they say they are. Weak financial institutions don't lend. This is what was referred to in Japan in the 1990s as zombie banks. I had a lot of fun on the Congressional Oversight Panel asking Tim Geithner if Citigroup and Bank of America were zombie banks. It's no question in my mind that they are. Now we come to the bad policy. Government austerity policies, meaning cuts in public spending, cut back on public investment. They lay off public workers, teachers, firefighters, park rangers, and they reduce the incomes of the unemployed and the poor. That's how you implement austerity, by doing those things. And when you do those things, unemployment rises, consumer spending falls, housing prices fall with it, people default on their student loans, and back you go to the top of the slide. This is what we've been doing for the last couple of years. Right? This is bad policy par excellence, and again, this is how we got the Great Depression in the 1930s, and how we stuck with the Great Depression in most of the world through the 1930s outside the United States. And in case you didn't think that mass unemployment was serious enough as a problem, let me suggest to you there are a few other problems that are coming. We see it in Europe, but we don't see it in Europe only. I would suggest we see it in Arizona too. The rise of the politics of hate against the backdrop of, and then we're going to get some political science terms, political fragmentation, delegitimization, which means people don't believe in their government anymore, and paralysis. We were talking about paralysis when Molly was talking. There's a great quote from William Butler Yeats about this, that we live in a time where often it seems that the best lack all conviction and the worst are filled with a passionate intensity. That's why I feel better about listening to Molly, because I feel like we have some conviction among the best. Now, the rise of the politics of hate, and by the way, I mentioned Arizona. It was unfair not to mention Alabama too. Emerging markets, China, India in particular, facing this economic crisis, lack political institutions to manage economic hardship. So it's not clear what growth level is necessary for social stability in China. Social stability in China is a very serious thing. It's not clear the world economy could take the consequences of social instability in China in a major way. And finally, and most importantly, we've created a political and economic environment where we cannot address climate change. We cannot afford not to address climate change. Now this, I don't know if you can read this font, but we need a virtuous cycle. Instead of a vicious cycle, we need things to go in a positive direction. Right? We got to start by putting people back to work. How are we going to put people back to work when no business person has confidence that there's going to be anyone to buy their products and services? That's the reality of what the problem is here. The way we put people back to work is through public investment. Right? That's how we solve the Gordian knot. Public investment means universities. It means schools. It means preschool education. It means infrastructure of all kinds. It means our collective wealth. Investing in public investment, dealing with our $2.2 trillion old-fashioned infrastructure deficit, and our need to invest an equivalent amount, another $2 trillion, to build the infrastructure of Molly's generation. If we do this, it creates jobs, boosts demands for goods and services, and makes us competitive. And we'd better do it because our international competitors are doing the same right now, and they've got a big head start on us. Public investment creates jobs. Secondly, we've got to fix the housing mess and the student loan mess. And I confess that I left the student loan mess out of the slide, which is the kind of thing Molly was talking about earlier. We've got to fix the housing mess and the student loan mess through principal write-downs. This will actually lead to stronger banks, not weaker banks, and healthier household finances. We have to, those things, putting people back to work, dealing with the financial mess, through principal write-downs, through restructuring student loans, will lead to rising consumer spending. People have money and confidence, and banks that lend to actual businesses, which would be a great change, a surprising positive change. The notion we can get banks to lend to businesses. If those things happen, then more investment leads to rising productivity. Now we need this little thing called worker bargaining power, because if we don't have worker bargaining power, productivity just makes the rich richer. We tried that for the last 30 years. It doesn't work out too well. But if we get the wealth we create distributed to the people who create it a little bit, then we actually get stronger demand. People can pay taxes, tax receipts go up, expenditures to keep people going when they're unemployed go down, and the result is a healthier, more balanced budget, the kind of thing Republicans want. Right, and a growing economy that can support further private and public investment, which creates more jobs and further increases productivity. And then you go back to the top of the slide again. And this time, you're a lot happier going back to the top of the slide than you did on the vicious cycle slide. Now, that's our choice, vicious cycle or virtuous cycle. And now along comes the fiscal trap. The fiscal trap is what we face this fall. The worst possible thing you could do in this situation, where we are underinvesting in public assets so that we are endangering our country's competitiveness, and we have an economy that is sluggish with mass long-term unemployment, the worst possible thing we could do would be to impose austerity in the short run and cut taxes on the rich in the long run. That is a recipe for immediate economic pain, political instability, and national decline. And surprise, surprise, that's the Republican agenda. Their agenda is to use the threat of something called the sequester. The sequester is an automatic axe that's going to fall and cut $1.2 trillion out of the federal budget at the end of the year, unless something comes along to change it. Half of that money comes out of domestic discretionary spending, half comes out of the defense budget. Republicans are going to come along and say, oh, can't have that happen. Can't have that happen. And on top of that, by the way, the payroll tax cuts that President Obama passed that have kept our economy alive, they expire too. Republicans will say, we can't have these things happen, and we don't want to raise taxes on anybody to make up the $1.2 trillion. And so they're going to say, we won't do anything. We're just going to jam everything unless the president agrees to a long-term extension of Bush tax cuts for the wealthy, and deeper cuts in domestic spending. Domestic spending means things like education and parks, the good things in life, unless the president agrees to extension of the Bush tax cuts. But they're going to pile on, want more and more domestic cuts. Now this is, as I said, it's not just that it's cruel, because it is. It is going to be cruel if this kind of stuff happens, and unfair. And it's not just that it will line the pockets of the wealthiest among us who don't need the money, but it is a recipe for national decline. It is a recipe for ensuring that we don't educate our children, that we don't enter the new age of energy technology, that we don't fix the roads and the potholes that are outside this door, right? That we don't do anything about the fact that in every major American city, it takes 2 to 3 times as long to get to the airport than it does in the major cities of the rest of the world. Those things matter, and we're not going to do anything about them if this agenda goes through. But this is not the only threat. We also, it's not just that you have this really hard right, reactionary redistributionist agenda coming at us from the Republican Party. It's that we have something else called the inside the Beltway agenda, or as Congresswoman Schakowsky discussed, the Simpson-Bowles agenda. And it does the same thing, but less obviously. Simpson-Bowles agenda avoids the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. It cuts Social Security and Medicare. Remember when I said a vicious cycle involves doing things like cutting the incomes of poor people in a recession? Cutting Social Security and Medicare, that's what that's about. And to my mind, the worst thing about Simpson-Bowles is that it guts our corporate tax system through a sneaky little trick called territoriality, where we don't tax offshore profits. You know what happens when you don't tax offshore profits, but you do tax onshore profits? Everybody goes offshore where they don't have to be taxed. Somebody in the Simpson-Bowles Commission thought that that would be a good way to address our revenue problem. Now, that's the setup. That's what we got to worry about. And now the question is, will Democrats, because we know what Republicans are going to do, the question is, will Democrats start making unilateral concessions? There are a lot of wonderful things about the Democratic Party, but we have this little weakness, which is this tendency to make unilateral concessions, to just give things away and hope that people will love us better. And we now know where that ends. All right? That worked out so well last summer? All right. Now, never let it be said that people can't learn. So today, as we stand here, President Obama is not making unilateral concessions. He's sending the right message. And his message has been pretty loud and clear, pretty tough, is no more extensions of the Bush tax cuts for families making over $250,000 a year. That's the top 2%. None. And by the way, as far as I'm concerned, most people who make over $250,000 a year are millionaires. A millionaire is somebody with more than $1 million in assets. That's what a millionaire is. A millionaire is not somebody who makes $1 million a year. It's somebody who has $1 million. People who make over $250,000 a year typically have $1 million. It's one of the wonderful things about making 5 times as much as the median family. $250,000 a year is 5 times as much as the typical American family makes. And the other thing that President Obama has said, and this is critical because otherwise you just get gamed. President Obama has said if the Republicans want to go over a fiscal cliff, meaning to trigger the sequester, if they want to go over the fiscal cliff for a few days and see how that feels, in order to protect tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, President Obama said he's perfectly happy to negotiate the next day, after the public can see clearly what the congressional Republicans are jeopardizing in order to keep the wealthiest even more wealthy. Now, we have an agenda. There is an agenda, and the public supports it, that will do what our country needs. And by the public supporting it, I mean that we have this, at the AFL-CIO, we have this giant polling database. And the polling on these issues is generally over 70% positive. In some cases, it's over 80. The public supports massive investment in infrastructure, rebuilding manufacturing, and rethinking our trade model so that we can be competitive in the new globalized economy. The public supports a tax system where the wealthy pay their fair share, and the public supports the notion that that means higher taxes for millionaires. The public supports accountability for the banks that broke our economy. And the public supports, although you'd never know it if you lived here in Washington, the public supports protecting and expanding Social Security and Medicare. And by the way, the American labor movement thinks that given that the pension system has been destroyed and taken away from us and robbed from us, and that it's been replaced by essentially savings accounts that have no money in them, that what might be in our nation's interest is not to dismantle Social Security, which is actually close to 90% funded and is the healthiest part of our retirement system, that dismantling Social Security is not what we need to do as a country. We need to strengthen it. And that Medicare is not the problem, Medicare is the solution. Now, just to illustrate again the short-sightedness and the self-centeredness of the aged, the other bullet that belongs here is that education, and particularly higher education, is a right and not a privilege. Now, I'm going to conclude by saying this. This is in substantial part and directionally the agenda that President Obama stands for. This is substantially and directionally the agenda of the congressional Democrats. But what it needs to be is an agenda that our political leaders pursue at scale. When we talk about infrastructure, we need to be talking about trillions, not billions. When we talk about a tax system where the wealthy pay their fair share, repealing the Bush tax cuts is not enough. It doesn't even begin to be enough. They're waving the sign at me, but I can't even begin to talk about what accountability for the banks means. The problem, why is it that this agenda, which has 70%, 80% public support, why is it that this agenda is like nowhere to be seen in Washington? I mean, not nowhere to be seen. It's obviously to be seen on this panel. It's obviously to be seen here at the Campaign for America's Future over the next couple of days. But why is it that we're not reading about, why are we not reading editorials in the Washington Post calling for this agenda? Why are we having to have even a discussion about scale? What has gone wrong? The fundamental challenge that we face as a nation after our collective bad bet on finance over the last 15 or 20 years is how do we overturn the political power of the winners in a losing game? You could call this, by the way, the Mitt Romney problem, or you could call it the Jamie Dimon problem. Right? What is Jamie Dimon doing at the Senate hearing wearing presidential cufflinks? That's an agenda, that's the agenda that really faces us. The public knows where to go here. The public knows how to make sure that we prosper in this century. We've got an obstacle, and it's the entrenched power of money in our politics, and it's time to move that obstacle aside. Thank you.
Okay.